to the National Council members headed by Knight Francis Bumidiano, to all the chapters of this organization, Brotherhood and Fellowship, and its members, brothers and sisters, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever the case may be at this time around, wherever you are. I would like to welcome all of you to the second edition of the SUUL orientation. But first and foremost, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity, once again, for this chance to be able to be of service to our organization by conducting this orientation. But beforehand, please allow me to introduce myself. I am Knight P. Amamanpon. I survived and joined the knighthood in the summer class of 1974. I was the very first keeper of the key and second Supreme Knight elected in Alpha, the mother chapter. I am one among the few whom assisted in making our ever first CBL in the history of SUUL. In fact, I authored the function and responsibilities of the keeper of the key positions, as well as some provisions in Article 5 of our Constitution and Bylaws, which up until now, I know it's still enforced. I am also one of the past elected Supreme Minister, elected for 2 consecutive terms, the first one being in 2013 and secondly in 2016, respectively. I am married to a wonderful person whom has been and will always be supportive of this organization, Sigma Upsilon, Upsilon Lambda Fraternity, and Sorority. I am a father of 2, to Rianne and Desiree, and a grandfather of a grandson so far, Axel Gray. I have been residing in Fresno, California since 1980. And other than SUUL, my dear brothers and sisters, I am also deeply involved in other civic organizations here in California. I'm not quite retired yet. I'm still in the workforce. In fact, I am currently the Food Safety and Quality Assurance Director at Golden Valley Grape Juice and Wine, a food and beverage manufacturing company based in California. At any rate, I would like to thank you, dear brothers and sisters, once again for this opportunity, and would like to welcome you to the second edition of SUUL orientation. During the first edition of this orientation, we have talked about our organization's history, some articles and provisions in our Constitution and Bylaws, to include but not limited to the provisions in Article 1, name and scope of the organization. We talk about our objectives in Section 2, or Article 2 rather, and declaration of principles in Article 3. During the first edition, we also talk about membership in Article 4, its classification and qualification. We have covered Article 5 as well, duties and obligation of the members, and covered some sections in the Bill of Rights, and even our preamble was covered during the second edition or the first edition of the SUUL orientation. At this time around, my dear brothers and sisters, please allow me to continue covering some of the provisions in our Constitution and Bylaws, or CBL in short. This time around, let me just focus on some relevant provisions that I believe it's a must to discuss and need some clarification to some of us. Let us start with Article 7, General Functions of the National Council and Local Chapters. Section 1 of this article, National Council take charge of the national affairs and shall have the direct administration, supervision over the local chapter. In other words, my dear brothers and sisters, it is the responsibility of the National Council headed by the Supreme Minister. A classic example is our Constitutional Convention, which hold every 3 years. It is the National Council's responsibility to determine and assign a chapter to host such event. It is also a prerogative of the National Council to ask the chapter or chapters to bid for the event hosting, as it is been a customary in the past years. Once a local chapter is determined to be the host of said event, the National Council then will oversee all the activities planned for such event. Everything, including preparation and planning, still needs the consent from the National Council, which in this case, the Supreme Minister, having been elected as chairman of the National Council. If for some reason the Supreme Minister foresee a concern that could potentially affect or jeopardize the success of such event, it is then the responsibility of the National Council as the governing body to make an assessment and make a determination, determine preventive measures to prevent such potential concern from happening. Bottom line, my dear brothers and sisters, the National Council has the total administrative authority over the local chapter hosting the event. Section 1.1 proclaim, recognize, and dissolve the local chapter. Now please allow me to expand this section in a more detailed fashion. Only the National Council headed by the Supreme Minister is authorized to proclaim, recognize, and dissolve an existing chapter. The proclamation and recognition of the chapter is based on certain requirements. It may be that the chapter applying for recognition has been a subchapter. The applicant chapter must have substantial members and can sustain on their own as an independent chapter. The recognition process has to be a collaborative effort between the sub and the existing chapter. Each shall submit a list of members and seats of officers during the application process. Also, will submit a letter of intent and preferably submit a letter of recommendation from the mother chapter sponsoring the chapter applying or subchapter applying for recognition. A chapter shall remain active provided is actively participating in any organization's activity and pay their annual dues regularly. Without doing so, dear brothers and sisters, such chapter may be subject to dissolution by the National Council. A dissolved chapter, due to non-compliance of the requirements, may be reactivated by the National Council upon payment of their obligations. Let's move on to Section 1.2, raise funds to finance the Constitutional Convention, Conference, and the national projects. During my term as SM, we have raised funds to finance the national conventions and other national affairs through solicitation of donors and sponsorships from and by the members. Section 1.5, promulgate important policies for the best interest of the organization. The National Council is responsible in declaring and or announcing publicly to the general membership, especially with regards to laws and regulation, and to put such laws and regulation into force and or effect. A classic example of which is the implementing rules and regulations in the conduct of initiation and other organizations' procedures and policies for any National Council event called by the National Council. Section 1.6, prescribe and design the uniformity of important forms such as organizations' logo, membership form, identification cards, IQ test, and other related documents. For your information, brothers and sisters, the provision regarding the logo was first made in effect and or in force during the ratification of the Constitution and Bylaws in the year 2010 during the Constitutional Convention held at the La Mesa Dam in Manila. The logo that was considered an official one is the original logo created by the late Ricardo Martires, the one with the context of brotherhood and fellowship. As per the CBL, no one is authorized to change its form and or context except during the National Constitutional Convention by any convention called by the National Council. Any event or movement by any member or group of members not called by the National Council is not and are not authorized to amend and or ratify the CBL, including the changing of the official logo. Now let's move on to Section 1.9, plan, organize, supervise all conventions. These chapters or sections in is related to Section 1 of this article. National Council to take charge of all the national affairs of the organization. Article 8, duties and responsibilities of the National Council and the local chapter officers. Section 1 of this article states, the National Council shall compose of the following. Section 1.1, Supreme Minister. He or she is the head of the organization and the chairman of the National Council. He or she is responsible for the approval of any document appertinent to his, her functions. He or she is the presiding officer during meetings, conferences, and constitutional conventions. He or she appoints officers to fill up positions and does other functions inherent to his position as approved by the Royal Court of the National Council. As we all know, dear brothers and sisters, leading a group which members whom have different personalities is not an easy job. More so, it is not an ideal position to be, especially if you are not compensated. But if you truly love this organization and that your sole purpose is to serve, compensation is not do not matter at all. Now let's talk about the Supreme Minister's responsibility. Being the head of the organization, the SM, it can proclaim, recognize, and even dissolve an existing chapter, enforce policies and procedures, and implementing rules and regulation or IRR, appoints officers to fill up vacant position of the National Council, and presides in every meeting of the National Council, such as the monthly meetings, conventions, conferences. Furthermore, it is the responsibility of the Supreme Minister to call a national consultative conference and other national affairs for purpose deemed necessary to address relevant issues, interests, problems of national and chapters concerned. Such call shall be communicated to the general membership. Speaking of Constitutional Convention, let's move on to Article 14, Conventions and Representations. Section 1, Annual National Convention. There shall be an annual national convention which commence on the last Friday of April, and venue shall be assigned by the National Council. If my recollection of things is on track, the very first annual national convention conducted for this organization was in 2014 during the first term of my administration. Section 2, Constitutional Convention. There shall be a constitutional convention every 3 years, which shall be jointly held with the annual national convention scheduled for that year, which shall commence on the last Friday of April, of which venue shall be assigned by the National Council. Once again, all the national affairs indicated in sections 1 and 2 of this article are subject to supervision by the Supreme Minister of the National Council. Section 3 of this article, all chapters of Sigma Upsilon, Upsilon Lambda, recognized by the National Council of the Fraternity and Sorority shall be obliged to be represented in the National Convention, District and National Consultative Conference, and other national affairs called by the Supreme Minister for purpose deemed necessary to address relevant issues, interests, problems of national and chapter concern. The requirement in this section clearly states that only the chapter recognized by the National Council can send delegates or represent their chapter during the national event such as the annual national and constitutional convention. Any chapter and recognized by the National Council have no right nor have any business to represent or send delegates to any of the affairs sponsored by the National Council. Section 3.2, Failure to send delegates for 2 successive constitutional convention shall be subject for dissolution. Now, this section talks about dissolving an existing chapter whom are not actively participating any of the national affairs of the organization called by the National Council. In this section, however, it is specifically stated that a chapter is subject for dissolution if it failed to send delegates for 2 successive conventions, even if such chapter is actively participating in a local event such as community service, etc. This chapter can be dissolved due to non-compliance of this provision in Section 3.2. If and when a chapter is dissolved due to non-compliance of the requirement, it's always a good practice to formally notify such chapter and put it on record. The notification shall have to be conducted by the National Council. Section 3.3. Only the good standing, registered, delegated chapter shall cast votes in the elections, division of the House, discuss issues, interest, and other concerns in the agenda calendared for the Supreme Minister in all meetings or consultative conference or in the national conventions. The requirement in this section is somewhat ambiguous and subjective. Let's start with being in good standing. Member or chapter. What do we consider in good standing? Well, to me, being in good standing in the member's perspective literally means that I have fully fulfilled my obligation to the organization by paying my monthly dues and have actively involved in any organization's activity. While in the chapter's perspective, such chapter has fulfilled its obligation by paying the chapter's annual dues, actively participating in any organization's activity as called upon by the National Council, and the chapter has not been dissolved. Now, what about in good standing delegated chapter? In my personal opinion, if a chapter is being delegated or represented during any given convention, the event, the National Council has registered during the event, then the members of such chapter shall be allowed to cast votes during election, division of the House, and discuss issues and other concerns. If the National Council imposes other requirement prior to the event, such as, for example, no ID, no entry policy, in addition to the prescribed requirements mentioned, it is deemed acceptable, provided that such enforcement shall be formally communicated to the general membership. It shall be included as one of the policies and procedures or House rules that will be enforced as a must requirement in the participation of the national conventions. Such communication shall be disseminated to the local chapter members 3 months before the convention as mandated in Article 15, Section 3 of our Constitution and Bylaws. Sometimes we are in a situation where in doing so is not at all possible due to situation that is beyond our control. And that's perfectly understandable under such circumstances, but since it is mandated in Article 15 of our Constitution and Bylaws, it has to be done. And if I cannot do it because of some circumstances beyond my control, the requirement is you have 3 months. You're given 3 months to be able to do so. So, if I can, I would rather do it even if it's late, because to me, it's better being late than never at all. Now let's talk about a little about Article 15, Assembly. Our Constitution and bylaws is structured both a democratic and republic form of governance. It is a form of governance in which the supreme power resides in the member or members, while at the same time, a governing body in which governs the organization according to the law is elected by the members. In our case, the governing body that I'm talking about is none other than the National Council. My dear brothers and sisters, it is evident that the National Council is the only governing body authorized to call for a national consultative meetings, conferences, and conventions, all of which has to be presided by the National Council Supreme Minister. Not any member or group of members can participate or engage in any act of direct governance simply because our Constitution and bylaws, or our organization rather, is not participating or practicing direct democracy. We have elected a governing body, which is the National Council, whose members are entrusted with all the authorities as outlined in these articles previously mentioned, specifically Article 7 and Article 14. A group of members can only exercise its power directly if the elected governing body, which is in our case the National Council, is ousted, meaning that they are non-existent. Okay, I think this orientation is getting lengthy, but please allow me to discuss some provisions and sections that are recently added during our recent ratification of our Constitution and bylaws held in Surigao. In Article 16, I believe, General Provisions. And I would like to touch the newly added Section 20 and 21, respectively. Now, Section 20 states, implementation of permanent ID as per the designed and prepared by the group to be followed in all local chapters and for actual counting of members and preparation for the database. Designed and prepared by the group. What are we talking about this group? We're talking about the National Council. This is really a good idea, and I'm commending the current National Council for formally incorporating this in our Constitution and bylaws as mandatory requirement. Such requirement, I know it will enhance the quality of our documentation. Section 21 states, using only our original logo in every chapter, all other design must be removed. I repeat, all other design must be removed for the purpose of one logo, one design in every activities. The logo should be shown in our Constitution and bylaws. Again, this is also an important provision that I hope it will really be implemented and reinforced. Now, my dear brothers and sisters, I hope that we have learned something from this edition 2 version of orientation. I hope I have covered everything there is that needs covered. And most importantly, I certainly hope that each one of you have gained something from this and will use such knowledge as a tool to eventually help us make our organization grow and prosper. I'd like to close by saying thank you once again for sharing some of your precious times watching this video in spite of all the competing priorities in your daily undertakings. Goodbye for now. Until next time, God bless us all. In unity we stand. Thank you so much for watching.